Oh boy, here's something I bet you've never seen before, a ranking of every Pixar movie.
Yeah, I know this idea's been done many times before, but with their most recent film being their biggest hit ever, and the fact that I've now actually seen all of them, I figured, why not? I think it's safe to say Pixar is one of the most beloved animation studios to ever exist, because despite the ups and downs over the last several years, they've still produced some of the most popular animated movies of all time, and arguably changed cinema forever by popularizing the use of computer animation, all of which can be traced back to its founders, Pete Docter and some other guy.
But of course, not all of their films can be bangers, so let's go through and see which ones are the best and the worst, at least in my opinion. I feel like I'm gonna have some pretty hot takes in here, but we'll get to those later. Right now, if we want to get to the good stuff, we gotta trudge through some sludge.
Boo! You stink!
Oh wow, the worst Pixar movie ever made. Gee, that sure is a tough question, huh? I wonder which one it could possibly be. It's The Good Dinosaur. I mean, come on, I feel like that's pretty obvious. I think this might be one of the only Pixar movies that actually has no defenders.
Seriously, I've never seen anyone anywhere say they like this movie. If you are aware of someone who does, please let me know.
Anyways, this movie was actually interesting for me because it didn't quite hit me how bad it was until a certain point. For the first act or so, I thought,
okay, this isn't amazing, but we're about 20 minutes in, and I don't hate it so far. It's just a bit bland. Maybe this won't be as bad as I thought.
Then later on, it was starting to lose me, so I checked how much time was left in the movie, and I saw that 7 minutes had passed since the last time I checked. It was then I knew this wasn't gonna be a fun hour. Yeah, everything you've heard people say about this movie is true. Nothing freaking happens. It's one of the most boring movies I've ever watched. Good Dinosaur. More like Good Dinosaur. Okay, I'm so sorry, that was awful. Arlo is not a likable protagonist since he just comes across as whiny. His dad dies literally out of nowhere, and it leaves no emotional impact. Spot is kinda cute, I guess, but he does almost nothing, and they come across a wide variety of side characters who are so bland and unimpactful, I cannot name a single one. I guess the T-Rex was kinda cool, and the pterodactyl eating this little creature was literally the only time I laughed in the entire film, so that was nice. Outside of those, this movie has almost nothing to work with. I know it had a really rough development, and you can easily tell, because the few interesting ideas it has just get thrown right out the window. Humans and dinosaurs coexisting could be really fun, but they don't do anything with it. The dinosaurs are just generic dinosaurs. The kid is just a feral kid. There is nothing unique about this movie at all. The only thing slightly interesting is the dinosaurs farming for themselves, and even that isn't very remarkable. But with that said, there are a few redeeming qualities. I think it goes without saying the backgrounds in this movie are gorgeous. I mean, seriously, why do they look so good? But even those clash against how cartoony and ugly the characters look, and there are a couple of actually good emotional scenes. The part where Arlo and Spot tell their backstories with these little sticks was cute, and the scene where they say goodbye was actually a little touching, since, okay, I don't really buy their connection, but I do like how it's done with no dialogue. Aside from those, this movie was a whole bunch of nothing. Really impressive screensaver, pretty lousy film.
I'm a brave boy. Not a brave enough boy for this!
Well, you know what they say, when the Good Dinosaur comes in a ranking, brave is soon to follow.
Yeah, this movie frickin' blows. Genuinely, the most impressive thing about it is the animation on Merida's hair. Once again, this movie had a really rough development, and it's even more obvious here, since there are so many conflicting plot points, and of course, they focus on the wrong ones. Oh, would you look at that? Merida has to marry a man she doesn't know because of tradition, and she really doesn't want to. Gee, does that sure sound familiar? Yeah, the mother is actually one of the most unlikable characters in any Pixar movie, and the craziest part is, Merida isn't much better. She's just so whiny and barely does anything throughout the entire movie. The poster and trailer make it look like she's gonna be a badass, and we only really get one cool scene with the archery competition. Aside from that, she does almost nothing. And that's just the first 30 minutes or so. The movie goes from frustrating to stupid when she turns her mother into a bear, because sure, why not? Now, I will give credit, the way the bear moves is kinda funny, and thank Christ they didn't make her talk, but this is a beyond stupid plot point, and Merida literally gets no repercussions from it. And that's not even getting into these annoying little brats. At least the dad is kinda funny, but the rest of the characters are not interesting or likable at all. The craziest part is this movie could have been awesome. The scene where Merida finds the wisps and when she's exploring the ruined castle are really cool. During these parts, I was like,
why couldn't the rest of the movie been about this?
Go into the backstory of this ruined kingdom, make more interesting, I don't know, just do something other than bickering with Mother Bear. With that said, this movie got a few more laughs than The Good Dinosaur, and like I said, the archery scene was really cool, but that is all this movie has going for it. How this film won Best Animated Feature against Wreck-It Ralph and Paranorman, I will never understand, because good God, this movie is bad.
That's my character. I'm the trash man.
Toy Story 4 frickin' sucks. I know this movie is really divisive, and it does have its fans, but wow, I am not one of them. I'm honestly shocked at how much I didn't like this movie, but the craziest part is, it starts out pretty promising. The opening 30 minutes or so with Forky is really solid. Woody's goal to protect him is fairly compelling, and Forky literally trying to throw himself away is actually really funny. Plus, I think the idea of a toy being literally made by a child is decent, but then they enter the antique store and the whole thing takes a complete nosedive. I'm genuinely stunned at how boring this movie is. Everything that happens is either a painfully unfunny joke or a rehash of the previous films. Woody feels like he's losing his kid. There's a toy who's upset because she's never been played with. A friend is captured and we have to save them. Buzz goes on a mission to find Woody. All of this has been done before in the other movies.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Almost all of the characters from the previous films are completely sidelined, and the new ones range from boring to unbearable. Gabby is just a less interesting Stinky Pete. Bo could be interesting, but she just comes off as bland. Her Polly Pocket friend is kinda cute, I guess, but she doesn't do anything. Duke's backstory is funny, and I like Keanu Reeves' performance, but he isn't given any funny lines to say. And speaking of not having any funny lines, good God, Key and Peele were insufferable in this. Yeah, I'm not calling them their character names, they're just Key and Peele reading from an awful script.
How do you make Key and Peele unfunny? Just how?
The only character besides Woody that does anything is Buzz, who's reduced to a stupid running joke about listening to his inner voice. I mean, Jesse pops a tire at one point, but that's it. And needless to say, the climax is just awful. There's one decently emotional scene with Gabby, I will give it that, but the toys literally hijacking the RV might be one of the stupidest things in any Pixar movie. And of course, the ending just feels insulting. It goes against not only Woody's arc from the third movie, but the second one too. Andy might not play with me anymore, I don't care. I still want to be there for him and his friends. Bonnie doesn't want to play with me anymore? Okay, bye. I guess what they were going for is he found a new purpose of helping lost toys find new owners, but this literally comes right out of nowhere. Aside from the scene with Gabby, this is something that isn't even mentioned once, nor does he say this to Buzz when he leaves. The only thing we see of this is the credits.
I know there are people out there that like this movie, but I'm sorry, I just couldn't stand it.
Even with the ending taken out of the picture, this movie as a whole was dull, boring, and not funny at all, aside from the first 30 minutes and an occasional chuckle. This isn't the worst Pixar movie ever made, but it is the one that made me the most angry while watching it.
Okay, we're finally done with the 3 out of 10 movies, so now we can move on to the 4 out of 10s. Yay!
I'm you from the future.
That doesn't even make sense.
You know, I'm pleasantly surprised. Lightyear was much better than I thought it was gonna be. I thought it was gonna be awful, and it wasn't. It was mediocre. Yeah, my expectations for this movie was not high, and that's being generous. Along with The Good Dinosaur, I almost never see anyone defending this movie. But I can say it doesn't start out horrible, at least. Eminently, the art style isn't super appealing, and the world is not interesting at all, but the idea is kinda neat, I guess. Watching these people grow and slowly adjust to life on this new planet is kinda nice. I think this might have actually been a pretty decent short film. And then the second act happens and everything becomes extremely dull.
And shockingly, that's not the biggest dip in quality, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Buzz in this movie has no personality whatsoever, and as many people have pointed out, they're taking a character that was originally meant to be a parody and making him that thing he was supposed to be parodying, while adding nothing new whatsoever. And the side characters are somehow even more forgettable, to the point where I can't even name a single one of them. Except Socks, he's adorable and was way too good for this movie. There are a couple of kinda heartwarming scenes, like when they find the vending machine and when they see this message from the old commander, that's pretty sweet. But then it's completely canceled out by genuinely one of the worst plot twists I have ever seen in a movie. It's been beaten to death at this point, but it frankly deserves to be beaten more. Zurg being Buzz from the future is something I cannot possibly fathom anyone thinking is a good idea. It comes right the hell out of nowhere, completely contradicts earlier source material, and doesn't work in any way at all. Old Buzz is just as boring as young Buzz, his plan makes no sense, and there is nothing that indicates he would become a villain. It is one of the few things I can think of that actively destroys almost any goodwill this movie had.
But I would still rather rewatch this than the previous movies on this list, since it wasn't as boring and it got some huge laughs out of me after the credits.
Oh, not the robot still going on when everyone left, though that is actually pretty funny. I'm talking about how they tease a sequel with Zurg Buzz coming back, like that's ever gonna happen. Oh, am I kidding? It might. Please don't.
My parents can't be spies. They're not cool enough.
Cars 2 is quite possibly the dumbest movie Pixar has ever made, and anyone who likes it is a complete idiot. I had a great time with this movie.
I seriously could not believe what I was watching was real. I want to see the boardroom meeting where this was pitched, because I cannot comprehend the fact that one of the most respected animation studios in the world decided it was a good idea to make a spy movie with sentient talking cars. This movie is freaking insane. The plot is extremely convoluted, most of the characters are complete idiots, and a lot of the jokes are horrible, but the one thing you certainly can't say about this movie is that it's boring. It goes all out with the spy stuff, and honestly, it's done kinda well. Like, the action scenes in this movie are actually pretty good, and the music goes weirdly hard. Plus, it gets crazy dark at points. There is literally a scene where a character is tortured and killed by the enemies. Cars 2 has a body count. I was laughing throughout the majority of this movie. It is just so absurd and so dumb, but it takes itself so seriously, I couldn't help bursting out with laughter. I will never understand why so many people hate this movie, because it is an absolute riot.
But even objectively speaking, I don't think this movie is as bad as people say it is.
Some of the jokes are unironically good, like the scene where Mater eats wasabi, or when he's referred to as extremely American for acting like a redneck, got genuine laughs out of me. And that's what makes this movie so delightful. The stuff that's actually kinda good is enjoyable, and the stuff that's bad is the best kind of bad. This isn't a good movie, but it is honestly some of the hardest I have laughed at any Pixar film. The movies below this I have no desire to ever watch again, but I will gladly watch Cars 2 multiple times. It's an anomaly like no other films before or after it, and unlike most people, I am extremely grateful it exists, if for no other reason than this meme. Objectively speaking, I can't put it higher than this, but in terms of enjoyment, this film will be at least 2 spots higher, maybe even more than that. So thank you, Cars 2, for being such an absolute joy in a way you were not intending to be. Also, there is a car pope in here, which implies there is also a car Christ, and that automatically makes this movie incredible.
Well, those are the 4 out of 10, so we're past all the ones that I don't like. Now we can just get to the ones I'm indifferent to, the 5 out of 10s.
We love our new home. There's so much space.
We have a guest room now.
But we have ants.
A Bug's Life is almost always regarded as one of, if not the weakest film in Pixar's golden years, i.e. everything before Cars 2. And I think that's a pretty fair reputation, since this movie isn't bad, but it's not all that special either. Its weakest element is definitely its story. It relies very heavily on the liar revealed trope, which has been overused to death even when this movie first came out. And it really drags down a lot of the film, especially the third act, where everyone's just moping around doing nothing. On top of that, most of the characters aren't very interesting. Flink and Anya are just kind of whatever, and none of the other ants do anything to stand out. But at the very least, the circus bugs are pretty funny, and Hopper is honestly a really cool villain. His design is great, his motivation is interesting, and he really does feel like an actual threat. Plus, the back and forth he has with his brother is hilarious.
And best of all, he's voiced by a real-life villain, so that makes him even more evil.
Obviously, the animation hasn't aged too well, since this was only Pixar's second film, but at the very least, the way it plays with perspective of everything looking much bigger is pretty impressive. But as a whole, this movie is kind of forgettable. It's the only one of the first 6 Pixar movies I had never seen before doing my marathon, and safe to say, I wasn't missing out on that much. It was okay, but I have no desire to ever watch it again.
And that's the only 5 out of 10, so now we can get to the 6s. Oh, wait, there are none. Okay, I guess we'll just get to the 7s.
Stop crying, it won't do any good, and anyway, you have a lot of work to do.
I already talked about this in my 2023 movies video, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much. The animation is insanely impressive, this movie is seriously gorgeous, the world building is really lopsided, with the fire people having really cool stuff, the water people being solid, air not having much, and earth having almost nothing. Element City is pretty generic, Ember is a solid enough protagonist, but none of the other characters really stand out, and the story is incredibly cliche and generic.
But I did say some parts got better on a rewatch and some parts got worse, so let's talk a little more about that.
The humor was honestly a bit of an improvement. Okay, this movie isn't hilarious, but I did get more laughs on my second watch than I did on my first. I ended up liking Ember and Wade's chemistry a bit more. They still aren't one of my favorite Pixar couples, but they work well enough, and I really like the song that plays during their montage. Plus, the way Wade lights the mother's incense is really inventive. But the stuff that got worse for me is the third act. This was already the weakest part of the movie, but it was even more obnoxious upon my second viewing. Not only does the climax feel insanely rushed and out of nowhere, but it pulls out almost all of the cliches you'd expect. The liar reveal, the third act breakup, the fake out death, this is all stuff we've seen a million times before, and nothing new is added. But I will say the ending scene is very nice. I definitely saw it coming as they built it up earlier in the movie, but it was still pretty touching. And I'm still kinda mixed on Ember and Wade touching, since it is done decently, but I feel like it could have been more interesting if they couldn't touch, but we're okay with it. This movie wasn't a huge hit at first, but it gained more of a following, and I'm glad to see so many people are enjoying it, since you can tell a lot of personal care was put into this movie. I just think it could have used a bit more originality. Not an amazing movie, but still a decent enough watch.
How does it feel to be voted the most hated man in America?
So, here's the part where people get mad. I'm not really the biggest fan of Toy Story 3. I know. Let me explain.
I first saw this movie in middle school after rewatching the first 2, which I hadn't seen since I was a kid, and I liked this movie, but didn't quite love it as much as everyone else does. So when I did this rewatch, I was wondering if maybe I was being a bit too harsh on it, and not gonna lie, this movie got a bit worse. Alright, let's start with the good stuff, since I think the opening is pretty strong. I like how we get one last scene of Andy playing with his toys, and this time we actually see what's going on in his imagination. That is great, and we never really saw something like that in the previous films. The closest thing we got was the video game. And seeing how the toys are coping with him going off to college and Woody assuring them Andy will hold on to them is really good. They built this up in the second movie, so it's nice to see it get some payoff. And then he puts them in the bag and the problems start to arise. First off, why didn't the toys believe Woody when he said Andy was putting them in the attic? Like, they have no reason not to trust him. What benefit does he have by lying to them? This makes no sense at all.
But okay, let's look past this a little bit because I do have some other issues. At least for me personally, I think the second act of the film kind of drags.
I don't think Sunnyside is a very interesting location. I get the idea of how it at first looks really pleasant and then ends up being horrible, but that still doesn't make it that enjoyable. The other films had a decent variety of locations to travel to, but here we're pretty much exclusively in the daycare, which isn't awful, but it's not that fun either. I also think this movie takes itself a little too seriously. One of the strongest elements of the first two films is the comedy, and I don't really find this movie that funny. There are some good jokes here and there, but especially in the middle, there are not that many. And to top it all off, I don't find any of the new characters very interesting, with the exception of Lotso. He is a legit fantastic villain. He's just so conniving and hateable, despite appearing so cuddly. I never thought I would hate a teddy bear this much, but they succeeded. But thankfully, this movie picks up during the third act. Once we get to the prison escape scene, that's when this movie becomes fun again. The scenarios are creative, the suspenseful moments work, and it has some of the funniest moments in the entire series. Mr. Potato Head becoming a tortilla is just priceless. And the climax of the dump is pretty freaking intense, even if the logic of why they went in the dumpster is kind of ridiculous, but whatever. Them running through the trash compactor is super cool, and man, did I just want to punch Lotso when he left them to die. I will admit I think the incinerator scene was a bit much, since you know they're not gonna kill them all off, but it works fine enough. But now we get to the biggest moment that everyone praises the hell out of, the ending.
I don't think it really works. Hear me out!
My biggest issue with the scene is that Andy and Bonnie have no real connection with each other. We've never seen them interact before this, and hell, for all I know, they've never met before, so him giving these supposedly really precious things to her despite barely knowing her kinda takes away the impact for me. I don't know, maybe if she was his little cousin or his neighbor or something, it worked a bit better, but that might just be a me thing. On top of that, I feel like this is only really gonna get a huge emotional reaction out of you if you grew up loving, and I mean loving, the Toy Story movies. And while I did watch these, they were never some of my favorites, so yeah, this didn't really do much for me.
I want to reiterate, I do like this movie. I think there's some really good stuff in it. I just don't see it as the masterpiece that everyone else does.
If you told me 2 Pixar movies were nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, this would not be one of my first guesses. It's a pretty good movie, but in my opinion, it's the weakest of the series, or at least it was, and far from the best Pixar has to offer.
Don't leave me here! I'm in hillbilly hell!
In the past several years, I've been seeing Cars get quite a bit of hate. A lot of people regard this as the worst of Pixar's golden years, and honestly, I don't really see why. Maybe I'm biased, as this was the second movie I ever saw in theaters, but I've always had a soft spot for this movie, and rewatching it, I still enjoyed it. But it's not without problems, with the biggest one being the pacing. Seriously, why the hell is this movie 2 hours long? It's longer than The Incredibles, and that movie earns its runtime by having a lot of story. This is honestly pretty straightforward, and as such, many parts of the movie kinda drag. Radiator Springs isn't the most visually interesting place, and most of the side characters don't really do much, but the backstory is honestly pretty interesting, and I really like the scene where Sally tells Lightning about it. Lightning McQueen isn't one of the best Pixar protagonists, but I do like the fact that the main character of a family film starts out as really egotistical, and we really do see him grow over the course of the film, leading to a really touching moment at the end. Mater is kinda hit or miss for me. I know a lot of people that hate him, and he can get kind of annoying, but he honestly has some pretty great jokes in this movie, but not as many as the legend himself, Chick Hicks. This guy is way funnier than it has any right to be, and I love the fact that he's probably the only villain character in a sports movie to actually win. That's just great. And honestly, the strongest thing about this movie is Doc Hudson.
I know that sounds weird, but I think he's a legit, really good character.
His backstory is compelling, it parallels McQueen's, he both directly and indirectly helps him grow as a racer and as a person, and jumping ahead, we get even more parallels between them in the third film. I think there's more value in this movie than a lot of people are willing to give it credit for, and most of that comes from Doc. Of course, I should bring up the thing that everyone talks about when criticizing this movie, and that's the world building. They do not do a very good job of explaining how this world works. Yeah, that's an issue, but I don't think that's enough to kill the movie for me. It's pretty clear that's not meant to be a major focus, so I'm willing to look past it and enjoy the rest of the film. Cars certainly isn't a masterpiece, but it has some really strong elements. I think part of the reason this movie gets so much backlash is because it came out during the prime years of Pixar. Hell, it was directly between 2 of their most beloved films ever, so people were expecting something much better. And it's not one of their all-time greats, but I still like it.
Even with all of that, though, nothing else compares to what is easily the absolute best thing that this movie gave us. The good version of Life is a Highway.
Life is a highway.
my way.
You are a toy!
Toy Story was the first Pixar film ever made, and the first fully CG animated film ever made, so I hold a lot of respect for it.
But I still see some people say this is one of the best Pixar movies ever, and yeah, I don't get it.
Like, it's a good movie, but in the almost 30 years that they've been around, still saying they've made very few or even no films that are as good as this one, yeah, I think that's a bit much. I mean, obviously the animation hasn't aged too well, you can't excuse it given the time period, but even still, it's also a very simple film with a pretty standard story, but it does that job well enough. The comedy is easily this movie's strong suit. This movie is genuinely hilarious. The scene where Buzz makes it look like he's gonna forgive Woody, but then attacks him is one of the funniest moments in all of Pixar. I know a lot of people complain about celebrity voice actors nowadays, and this was one of the biggest ones to popularize that, along with Aladdin, Lion King, and Shrek, but both Tom Hanks and Tim Allen do a fantastic job here. Plus, we got some other great talent like Wallace Shawn, Arlie Ermey, Ernest P. Worrell, and even freaking Janine from Ghostbusters. Like, I had no idea that was her for the longest time. But with that out of the way, let's get into this movie's problems besides the poorly aged animation. I think Woody is a little too unlikable in the beginning. I know that's the point, that's part of his arc, but I think he can come across as a little too selfish at points. But somehow the rest of Andy's toys are even more unlikable, since most of them completely ditch Woody for Buzz, and don't even try to give him a chance to explain himself, which seems kinda harsh. Sid works as a villain, but I don't think he's as good as a lot of people say he is.
And I know this is probably a really hot take, but I don't think that the supposed emotional moment of the movie really works at all.
The moment where Buzz realizes he's a toy and tries to fly out the window only to fall, gonna be honest, I was laughing during that scene. It just feels so silly, and you have that cheesy-ass song playing in the background. I'm sorry, but that just did not get the intended reaction out of me. But thankfully, the ending where they chase down the car is great. While Toy Story is a movie I hold a lot of respect for, it isn't a film I go out of my way to rewatch very often. It's a good film and an important part of history, but far from one of my all-time favorites.
Ever since a little kid, I've been fascinated with race.
I'm kinda surprised I put Cars 3 this high, since this is probably the most nothing of the Pixar sequels. And by that I mean this is the one people talk about the least. It isn't universally loved, universally hated, or super divisive. It just kinda happened.
But honestly, I think this is the best of the Cars movies.
Like I alluded to earlier, I really like the connection between Lightning and Doc's careers, and how he doesn't want to end up like Doc with a big crash ending his career prematurely, but in a strange way, he does end up like him by passing on the torch to a new racer. That racer being Cruz, who is actually a pretty likable character. Her backstory is interesting, her dynamic with Lightning is fun to watch, and it's cool seeing her grow over the course of the film. We go more into Doc's backstory despite him not even being in the film, since the original voice actor passed away right before the first one came out, and it gives us some really nice insight while also helping Lightning's arc of accepting his time in the spotlight is over and being okay with that. I'd say this is easily the most mature and complex of the Cars movies, but it also might be the slowest. It's not as long as Cars 2, but there are a decent amount of scenes that kinda drag. But there are some really good ones too. The Demolition Derby is a lot of fun, the final race is pretty exciting, and wow does that crash scene go way harder than it should. I didn't have huge expectations for this movie, but I was very pleasantly surprised by Cars 3. It isn't a masterpiece, but it did give us a solid conclusion to a very, very strange trilogy.
Well, those are the 7 out of 10 films, so now we can turn it up to the 8 out of 10s.
Did you finish college?
No!
Remember how I said Toy Story 3 got a bit worse on rewatch? Well, Monsters University honestly got a bit better. I remember liking this movie as a kid and being surprised that not many people liked it when it first came out, so it's interesting to see it's growing more of a following in recent years. And I can see why. The most common criticism I see directed at this movie is that it's just a generic college film aimed at kids. While there are some pretty cliche moments, there are a couple that help it stand out. For one thing, the Dean is not a villain, she's an antagonist. She has personal beef with Mike and Sully due to them destroying her scream can, but she also has legit reasons to fail them. Sully has the talent, but not the passion, and Mike has the passion, but not the talent, so they likely would have failed anyway. And while the bullies are kinda generic, there is one thing I like about them. They don't cheat. Any other movie like this would have them sabotage the heroes, but they don't. They play by the rules, make it to the end fair and square, and when they lose, they take it in stride, and I like that. The side characters grew on me a bit more. I like their varying designs and how they each use their own skills to their advantage. Mike's roommate being Randall is really funny, and their falling out plus Sully besting him in the scare games makes their dynamic in the first film much more interesting, but what really makes this movie special is the last third. This is one of those things I didn't fully appreciate until I got older. The fact that a family film has a main character cheat, another one try to prove himself and fail, realize he won't be able to achieve his dream that he's had since he was a kid, and him being okay with that because he's able to find a new talent is one of the most mature things I've ever seen. The scene where Mike and Sully talk at the lake is one of my favorite moments in any Pixar film, because it shows that despite their differences, they both have what the other one wants. And at the end, when Sully tells Mike like he's fearless, that just warms my heart.
Admittedly, the rest of the story is a little generic, and some parts definitely could have been fleshed out a bit more, but as it stands, I think this movie's fairly underrated.
I enjoyed this movie as a kid, but it got a lot better with time. Like I said, it's been gaining more of a following in recent years, and I'm glad to see that. Because while it didn't outshine the original, it is still a worthy follow-up that, much like the main characters, their skills lie in places you wouldn't expect. Also, that post-credit scene is absolutely hilarious. I think it's safe to say this is the most divisive Pixar movie ever made that isn't a sequel, and I think it's pretty easy to see why. This is without a doubt the most stylized movie in the Pixar catalog, and it's a style not everyone can really get into. The characters' movement and facial expressions go big, and I mean really big, which can be a bit of a turnoff for some people. And I won't lie and say it didn't get a little annoying at points for me, but for the most part, I enjoyed it well enough.
And as for the rest of the movie, I think it works really well.
Mei is a very realistic main character. I've seen a lot of people say she is a really accurate depiction of a 13-year-old girl, and while I can't speak on that personally, she is very endearing. And I surprisingly really liked her friend group. While they could have used a bit more personality traits, especially Abby, she felt a little one-note, the relationship these four have is really endearing. I love how they stand by Mei throughout everything, and they have some of the funniest moments in the film. The panda is also really funny. The way it moves and the creative ways Mei tries to hide herself are fantastic. But my biggest complaint with this movie is easily the mother. I know what they're going for, and I know these types of parents exist, but good God, she was just not a likable character to me. Maybe my opinion will change if I see it again, but she was just way too stupid for me to root for. But at the very least, Mei's father was pretty likable, and the climax of this movie was fantastic. Not only was this shot just perfect, but Mei deciding to keep the panda was something I honestly didn't see coming. And the scene where she sees her mother in the forest is super emotional and really well done. Still doesn't make me like the character, but it's great. My only other complaint with this movie is Tyler. He is a really annoying character, and I saw him being a 4chan fan coming a mile away.
But aside from those things, this is a very enjoyable movie.
I kinda see why not everyone got into it, but I do think some of the hate it got was pretty overblown. As a whole, this is a charming, funny, emotional, personal movie that I'm glad I finally got to see.
I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
Luca is such a weird film. Not the film itself, but because despite being very well received when it came out, nobody talks about it anymore.
Yeah, you ever notice how this movie just kind of disappeared from people's consciousness? Like, you rarely see it discussed anymore.
I mean, I kinda get it, since this is easily one of the smallest Pixar movies, meaning it's not about some big grand story, it's just about a group of kids trying to win a triathlon. It just so happens two of those kids are also sea monsters. It's funny, I saw some people say this turned them off when they saw the trailer, but I think this is a fun idea. It is similar to other films like The Little Mermaid and Ponyo, but it does it in such a unique way. Them trying to hide when water is sprayed on them is pretty funny, and seeing the contrast between Luca being fascinated by the human world while Alberto just wants to win the contest is really interesting. The movie's location is easily one of the strongest aspects. I want to know everything about the people in this little town, especially Julia's father. He might be my favorite character in the movie. I also really like the art style. The character designs are super unique, and they have some great expressions, plus the backgrounds just look gorgeous. I will say I did not care for the bully. I don't think this is a popular opinion, but I did not like this guy. He just felt really generic and pretty annoying. He's not interesting at all, and with the exception of the couple scenes, I didn't really find him that funny. And the falling out between Luca and Alberto feels really forced to me. It just didn't really seem necessary, but those are my only issues. The rest of this movie is insanely charming and just plain cute. If you want a nice and simple movie that'll make you smile and maybe a bit teary, then I think Luca is a fantastic option. Just try not to watch it when you're hungry, because I guarantee it will make you crave pasta. Why does animated food look so delicious?
Please don't tell me I needed to specify children's toys.
Toy Story 2 is often considered the best of the series, and I completely agree. Still don't think it's that great, though. Yeah, if you haven't noticed by now, I'm not a huge fan of the Toy Story movies.
I mean, I like them. I think they're good movies, mostly, but I just think they're the weakest of the most popular Pixar franchises, and I know for a fact I am the only one who thinks that, because you will never see a Pixar ranking that doesn't have at least 2 of these movies in the top 10 and at least 1 in the top 5, probably even top 3. Except for mine, obviously.
I don't know why, but something about these movies just doesn't click with me the way it does for so many other people. But with that said, this is a really good movie. It is by far the most interesting plot in the series, and both Woody and Buzz are at their best here. Woody's arc about questioning whether or not he should stand by Andy or go to Japan is really interesting. This is pretty much the only film in the series where Buzz is fully competent, since in the first one he thinks he's a toy and keeps getting distracted, the third one he switched to demo and Spanish mode, and the fourth one he's Flanderized. Okay, I promise that's my last jab at Toy Story 4. But here you really feel the connection that he and Woody have with each other, and you want to see them reunite. The side characters are also vastly improved. Jessie is a lot of fun, and her backstory is really emotional. Bullseye is just adorable. I love this little guy. And both Al and Stinky Pete serve as pretty solid villains. Al is really funny. I think Pete could have been a little more interesting, but he's still an improvement over Sid. The other ones, though, fall a little flat for me. Rex is great. He's probably the funniest character in the movie, and Mr. Potato Head's okay. He's better than he was in the first movie, at least. But Ham and Slink just feel like they're kind of there.
Seriously, someone tell me one personality trait of Slinky Dog and why he's one of the main recurring boring characters in the series, because he does nothing to stand out to me.
And the aliens don't even show up until the last 20 minutes, so you could have just cut them out completely, but they at least got a few laughs. The comedy is really solid, might be even better than the first film, the airport climax is a lot of fun, and the animation is a big step up from the first two Pixar movies. So yeah, I really like Toy Story 2. I still think it's a little overrated, but it's a very solid movie, and at least I'm not alone in thinking this is where the series peaked.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
Almost everyone seems to agree Toy Story 3 was the end of Pixar's golden years and Cars 2 began their downfall, since none of their films reached the same high points of the 2000s. That is, with the exception of 3 films, Inside Out, Coco, and Soul. And of these 3 films, I'd say Coco is the weakest for me by a decent amount, but it's still really good. The biggest issue for me was the beginning. The whole family being anti-music is something that's been done many times before, and while the reason is understandable, they come across as pretty unlikable. With the exception of Mama Coco, she is just precious, obviously. But thankfully the movie, ironically, comes alive when Miguel becomes dead. The Land of the Dead is one of the most beautiful locations Pixar has ever given us. In fact, Coco is one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen. The animation is on a whole nother level. But back to the story, this is where the movie really starts. I love the dynamic between Miguel and Hector. You really feel the connection that these two form with each other. And both of them are very likable in their own way. Miguel's passion for music is very infectious, and Hector's backstory has this great sense of mystery to it. The rules of how this world works are very well established, and thus we can easily be sucked in. I love the character designs. There isn't a single skeleton that you'd mistake for another one, which is really impressive. The songs in this movie are fantastic. This is the closest thing Pixar has ever given us to a full musical, intentionally, and oh my god, they gave us a modern twist villain that actually freaking works. It is possible! Ernesto is a legit great villain. Him being evil is kinda surprising, but it doesn't feel out of nowhere, nor is it completely obvious from the start, which is great. And it leads to another great plot twist that I legit did not see coming. Yeah, a lot of people bring up how he should have just torn up the photo, but even with that, he's a great villain. This is easily one of the most acclaimed modern Pixar films, and I can easily see why. It may start out a little rocky for me, but it just gets better and better as it goes on, with the ending being so emotional and one of the most heartwarming things I have ever seen. This is a fantastic movie that, unlike this guy, will never be forgotten. You ever have one of those movies you like quite a bit, yet still think it's kinda overrated because most people say it's a masterpiece? Yeah, for me that film is Up. These past 3 movies are some of the most beloved Pixar films ever. This wasn't intentional, by the way, and while I don't love them all quite as much as most people, of the 3, I think Up is the strongest. Of course, everyone talks about the opening, which I admit is very well done, but am I the only one who hasn't cried at it? I don't know, to me this felt sad, but not tragic. They lived a good full life together, and seeing Ellie go wasn't a huge tearjerker, but that's just me. As for the rest of the movie, it's really good. Carl is a delightfully grouchy protagonist. I really like the dynamic he has with Russell and how he slowly grows to care for him. Doug is just precious. I would die for this little fella. The attack hounds are hilarious. Charles Muntz is a great villain, and Kevin is just kinda there.
And I know everyone says they sob at the beginning of this movie, but to me the most emotional part is when Carl's reading the adventure book.
That one little sentence at the end is the most powerful moment in the film, and this movie might have the best score in all of Pixar. So with all this praise, you're probably thinking, what's wrong with it? Well, on top of it not being a huge cry fest for me like so many other people, there are a few moments that drag a little for me. And with the exception of the dogs, I don't find it quite as funny as a lot of other Pixar movies, but those are pretty small issues in the long run. This is an overall very solid movie. This is the first of 2 Pixar movies to get nominated for Best Picture, and I can kinda understand why with this one. It's got a great story, great characters, solid animation, and fantastic music. It might not have me bawling my eyes out like most people, but it's still a very wonderful film.
And now I got my wish, 'cause I know that I'm a gay bitch.
Finding Dory is the only Pixar sequel that doesn't seem to have a major consensus. It isn't universally loved, universally hated, really divisive, or even forgotten.
I've been told some people hate this movie, but I've never actually seen that hate myself.
Personally speaking, I think this film's really underrated. Out of all the Pixar sequels, this was my favorite at the time it came out. It's not as dark as its predecessor, but it's clearly not trying to be. For the most part, it's a more lighthearted adventure, and it does that really well. Dory is a very endearing protagonist, and feelings for her as a person aside, Ellen gives a fantastic vocal performance both in the comedic and dramatic moments. The aquarium is a really fun location to explore, giving us all sorts of fun characters to meet. The jokes are on par with the first movie. This is up there with some of the best comedy to come from Pixar, and the emotional moments do really work. The scene where Dory finally reunites with her parents is one of my favorite moments in all of Pixar. Plus, this movie has Hank. I love Hank. He's such a great antithesis to Dory's antics, and he does enough to be grouchy while still being different from Marlin. Not to mention he's the exact opposite of Gil from the first movie, where he desperately wants to stay in the aquarium instead of going back to the ocean.
Though I can't imagine Cleveland being much better.
And the climax of this movie is just so absurd and ridiculous that you can't help but love it. I laugh my ass off every time I watch this scene. Plus, one thing I didn't notice when I first saw this is how the main theme of the film is disabilities. Dory has a mental disability, Destiny's nearsighted, Hank lost a limb, I think. Do tentacles count as limbs? Whatever, doesn't matter. And Bailey thinks he lost his skill due to an injury, and there's also Nemo's fin, that doesn't play a big part in this. I really like this since it feels subtle. They aren't constantly beating you over the head with it. The way things are presented feels really natural, and we see how each of the characters work through these disabilities. The only issue I have with this movie is Marlin and Nemo don't really do much. They spend a solid 15 to 20 minutes outside of the aquarium, which is kind of ridiculous, and while they are important to the story, they could have done a little more. But aside from that, I really like this movie. I hope it gets more love as time goes on, because while I still prefer the first film, since obviously we haven't gotten there far yet, I think this is a worthy follow-up after all these years. Also, Baby Dory is the most adorable thing ever, and I will not hear otherwise.
Dungeons, dungeons, and more dungeons. Real life edition.
If you were to ask me what the most underrated film in the Pixar pantheon is, my answer would easily be Onward. No one really seems to like this movie that much, and I don't get why. There's two criticisms I see directed at this movie, with one that everyone says being Barley should have been voiced by Jack Black instead of Chris Pratt. And yeah, okay, Jack Black would have done a great job, but I think Chris Pratt works well enough. Also, I find it ironic that those are the exact actors that will play Mario and Bowser. And the other complaint is the world isn't fleshed out very well, and I kinda agree. There are some things that could have used a little bit more expansion, but I think what we get is some really cool stuff. The biker fairies are funny, the cave is pretty cool, and the Manticore opening a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant is hilarious. I love the dynamic between Ian and Barley. You really feel the connection these two have, and that ending scene where Ian realizes he did everything he wanted to do with their dad with Barley just tugs at my heartstrings so well. And I think Tom Holland gives a fantastic vocal performance.
Also, I really like the fact that Barley isn't jealous of Ian.
It would have been so easy for him to be upset that Ian can do magic and he can't, but no, he's just like, hell yeah, my brother's a freaking wizard, and that's just great. That ad is also really funny, despite just being a pair of legs. Seeing both the troubles he gets them into, but also the problems he helps them solve is a lot of fun. One of the most enjoyable parts of this movie is just seeing the different scenarios they get into and the various ways they get out of them. The climax is just fantastic. The monster they have to fight is super creative, all the main characters get their chance to shine, and the ending is seriously one of the most emotional moments in any Pixar film. It almost got me tearing up. What holds it back from being truly amazing for me is, like I said, the world could have been fleshed out. I think the idea of a modern fantasy world is really cool, but they could have gone a lot further with it, and there are a few scenes in the middle that kind of drag. Overall, I really like this movie, and I'm surprised to see rank it so low, because I think it deserves a lot more love. This is the only time Pixar released 2 movies in 1 year, and both got nominated for Best Animated Feature, and if you ask me, I think this movie totally earned its nomination, even if it lost to the other film, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Alright, that's the last of the 8 out of 10 films, so now we're getting into the really good stuff, the 9 out of 10s, which appropriately starts with number 9.
Okay, what are you talking about?
Rakukuni. What? Rakukuni.
Out of all the 2000s Pixar films, Ratatouille was the only one I hadn't seen prior to doing this ranking, and I had high expectations because this is easily one of the most beloved movies they have ever made.
And yeah, it's warranted. This movie's fantastic.
It is crazy how good of a movie this is. Despite being a very simple premise, it surprisingly has a lot of thought and care put into it. You wouldn't think something so silly would lead to a movie so mature and thought-provoking, but since this movie has such an amazing script, it really works. The characters are all super likable. Remy has such a simple goal, but you can very easily connect with him. Linguini is really fun to watch. I love Colette and her no-nonsense attitude. You can tell she takes her job really seriously, but she doesn't come across as a sick in the mud. She's just passionate about her career and thinks Linguini is there to mock it, which understandably pisses her off. But she really warms up to him as the film goes on. The strongest thing about this movie is the atmosphere. You really feel like you are in this kitchen watching these people make these dishes, and why do they look so damn delicious? The animation is freaking fantastic, and the shots they use to show things from Remy's perspective are a lot of fun, and I really like the idea of Remy talking to Gusteau's spirit. This not only gives us some insight into his character, but it also leads to some great laughs.
As good as this movie is, though, I do have a few issues.
One is much like Luca, I think the third act breakup is a little forced, not as much, but I don't think this was entirely necessary. 2, some slight issues with the pacing. Remy literally goes a solid half hour without saying a word, which I think is a little weird.
And 3, I know this is probably a hot take, but I didn't really like Skinner.
He felt like kind of a generic villain that I didn't think this movie needed. He's just a greedy asshole, and while I got a few laughs, I didn't find him that funny. But what is enough to make up for that is the ending. This film is a lot like Toy Story 3, where the ending is the thing everyone talks about, but instead of being a tearjerker, it's really thought-provoking. Anton Ego is a phenomenal character. The scene of him eating the ratatouille is super iconic for a reason, but what's even better is his review. That line about the meaning of anyone can cook might be one of my favorite lines in any movie I've ever seen. While I did have a few issues, this is an overall fantastic movie, and I'm really glad I finally saw it. I would say I'm upset that I missed out on it as a kid, but honestly, I don't think I would have appreciated it back then, because this is one of the most adult movies Pixar has ever made.
And the craziest thing is, out of the 3 Pixar movies that Brad Bird has directed, this one is the weakest for me.
Oh, I have anxiety.
The newest Pixar film, and arguably their most successful, this is one of the few Pixar sequels that people were actually asking for, and easily the most popular one outside from Toy Story 2 and 3. I was mad hyped for this movie, and safe to say, it did not disappoint. This does everything a good sequel should do. It introduces new characters, expands on the themes and ideas of the previous film, while also giving us new ones, vastly expands on the world, and pushes the characters in a new direction. The first film was primarily about joy and sadness, so it's nice to see anger, fear, and disgust get more focus.
Even if 2 of them do sound completely different, but I think I can live with one of those being replaced.
Anxiety is a great antagonist, since she's basically what Joy could have become in the first movie, trying to make Riley's life revolve around one emotion because she thinks she's the most important. You can tell she has good intentions, but she's clearly going too far. I'm kinda surprised at how much I got into Riley's story. Obviously, I cared about him in the first movie, but here I was engaged with it just as much as the emotions themselves, which is crazy. They really upped the comedy in here, since this movie is just full of amazing jokes. The gag in the vault with Pouchy had me absolutely dying, and the thoughts being an animation studio is just brilliant. I do still slightly prefer the first movie though, since I think it had the stronger emotional moments. Heh, funny. But it's clear that this one is going for a different angle, which I do like. This movie's climax is more intense, while the first one was more dramatic, and this line here hit a lot harder than I would like to admit. The only big flaw I have with the movie though is the side emotions. Embarrassment has a great arc, but Ennui doesn't do that much, and Envy does almost nothing. I think she could have been cut out in the movie completely. But even with that, this is a worthy follow-up to one of the most beloved modern Pixar films. It might not succeed the original, but it is certainly on equal footing. This would give me hope for the future of the studio, as long as they take away the right message from the film's success.
We don't just want more sequels, we want more good films.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
Honestly, what can I say that hasn't been said a million times about The Incredibles? This might be the single most discussed and analyzed film in the entire Pixar library, even more so than Toy Story. And it's easy to see why, since this is up there with Ratatouille as one of the most mature Pixar films ever, which interestingly was directed by the same guy. Strange. It was the first Pixar film to get a PG rating, back when that actually meant something, and it goes to some really dark places. A man attempting suicide in the opening scene, heroes being sued for saving people but also causing damage, Bob struggling to find meaning in his life, Helen being afraid he's having an affair, to a giant amount of heroes being murdered by the villain.
This is possibly the highest body count for any family film I've ever seen. The only one I can think of that comes close is maybe Kung Fu Panda 2, which I know sounds weird.
The animation is a little basic by today's standards, but as a whole it holds up pretty well, and the action scenes are awesome. The voice acting is great. I think this is one of the few Pixar films to not cast major celebrities as the main characters, Syndrome and Frozone excluded, and speaking of which, the characters in this movie are great. Mr. Incredible has a fantastic arc, and the struggles he goes through are very realistic. It's really interesting how the kids react to their powers in completely opposite ways. Violet wishes she was normal and didn't have them, while Dash wants to be able to use them as much as he wants and is upset he can't. Lucius is a great supporting character, Edna Mode is just an absolute icon, and Syndrome is hands down, flat out, no contest, no question about it, the best Pixar villain ever. His build-up in the beginning, his reveal later in the film, his insanely dark plan that he's mostly succeeded at, and the fact that he's able to be both hilarious and intimidating is phenomenal. Despite literally committing genocide, he's just a giant man-child trying to live out his fantasies. But he wants to be a hero for the wrong reasons, and because of that, when he tries to take the spotlight, he fails miserably, and even that doesn't stop him from trying to hurt his former idol, because he literally tries to kidnap his baby. This guy's just insane.
Honestly, my only issue with this movie is I wish the other characters got more focus.
Most of the movie is spent following Bob, which is good and all, it works, but it leads to the rest of the family feeling a little underdeveloped. Not bad, they're still likable and interesting, but they don't really add much to the movie until the second half. They worked fine as supporting characters, but I would have liked it if they played a bigger role in the story, since most of their arcs aren't that prevalent. But if my biggest complaint with the movie is that I wanted more of it, chances are your movie is pretty damn good. This is a movie I've loved ever since I was a kid, and my fondness for it has only grown more over time. It's easily one one of the most popular Pixar movies ever, and you don't need superpowers to see why.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
You know, I sometimes forget just how good Monsters, Inc. really is. Don't get me wrong, this has always been one of my favorites since I was a kid, but it's just kinda crazy how tight this movie's writing is. In fact, I think this is the absolute funniest Pixar movie of all time. The jokes just keep coming, and so many of them hit. Combine that with the S-tier vocal performances from Billy Crystal, John Goodman, Steve Buscemi, and just about everyone else in the cast, and you've got yourself some incredible comedy. Mike and Sully might be my favorite Pixar duo. The contrast of one being more calm and caring while the other is more loud and excitable works really well both from a comedic and dramatic standpoint. This is one of the few movies that earns the third act breakup. Instead of two people who just met getting angry at each other and leaving, this is a long-running friendship that's been tested throughout the entire film, and it finally reaches its breaking point when the two of them hit rock bottom. Mike is upset that he's lost his life, but Sully doesn't care anymore because he just wants to help Boo. You can easily see where both characters are coming from, and it makes the reconciliation much better. Randall is just a delightful villain. He's so slippery and cocky, and his camouflage makes him feel like a real threat. Plus, the climax with all the doors is just great.
And of course, I'd be hard-pressed not to mention what is still the best twist villain in Disney and Pixar history.
Waternoose is a perfect twist villain. Since it's properly built up, he's a prominent character throughout the film, we already have another villain, so it lets us let our guard down, and we get enough time of him actually being evil. I mean, he has the second most iconic line of any Pixar villain.
I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die.
His motivation is understandable, and he continuously tries to justify it, even though his actions are just heinous. It's kinda hard to really find much wrong with this movie. The world is really interesting, the character designs are memorable, the animation holds up really well, and the movie doesn't have that many emotional moments, but the few it has have really worked. This movie is just a certified classic, and it's one I'm almost always down to rewatch. The only thing missing is, when the hell are they gonna put that thing back where it came from, or so help me in actual play?
There you go. One Soul.
Soul is easily the most adult Pixar film ever, and yes, that includes the ones from Brad Bird. I mean, it's literally about exploring the meaning of life. I don't see too many kids getting into it more than adults, and given how this film came out during an eventful year, to say the least, I think it was exactly what people needed. It's just a simple story of a man named Joe hoping to pursue his love for music by becoming a professional, only to end up dying and trying to come back to life. The contrast between him being a soul that doesn't want to die and 22 being a soul that doesn't want to live leads to both some great comedy and some great themes. You really see the contrast between these two ideologies, and I love how we don't see specifically what causes 22 to get her Earth Pass, since it was an amalgamation of everything. And both Jamie Foxx and Tina Fey give great vocal performances. The animation is stellar. This is the most realistic looking Pixar movie ever, and I think they strike a great balance of being a fairly simple story like Luca, but still having both some higher stakes and an interesting world to briefly explore. So the movie is able to be both big and small at the same time. There's just so many charming moments in this movie, from speaking with the barber, to seeing how Joe found his love for music, to his mother finally seeing his point of view, to them helping Abby rediscover her love for the trombone. This is a movie that really makes you see the beauty of the little things in life, and I love that. It's able to do it in both a subtle way and a big way, but both work really well. Also, the clips with 22's old mentors are just absolutely hilarious.
If I had any criticisms with this movie, I do think the ending is just a little bit of a cop-out.
I knew they weren't gonna actually kill off Joe, but they go so far to make it look like he's accepting death only to pull back at literally the last minute. It just felt like a little bit of a tease. But the very ending shot is really nice, and I like how this is when the title finally appears, which is really clever. This movie really shows us that Pixar still has that magic. They may not be as consistent with bangers as they used to be, but every once in a while we get a movie that shows why there's something really special, and safe to say, Soul is a fantastic example.
We're just a clever visual metaphor used to personify the abstract concept of thought.
I just want to say that these two are probably the closest entries on this list. I went through a lot of back and forth over which one I prefer, but in the end, I think I gotta give the slightest edge to Inside Out.
I remember seeing this movie when I was in middle school, and it's only gotten better with time. Hard to believe it's almost 10 years old. Oh my god, that feels weird. Both this and the sequel have some of the most beautiful animation I've ever seen. The lighting and textures on the emotions is still crazy impressive, and one of the earliest examples of me being able to admire this technique. Joy and sadness make for a really fun duo, due to them both being polar opposites, and while Joy is definitely selfish in the beginning, she still manages to remain likable, since it's clear she has good good intentions, yet her logic is quite flawed. Anger is hilarious, his head lighting on fire is just comedic gold, and Lewis Black gives one of my favorite performances in all of Pixar. Fear is also really funny, and disgust is the weakest, but she's still fine enough. The world building is one of this movie's strongest aspects, from the memories to the subconscious, the memory dump, imagination land, dream studios, it's all just so clever and so creative. Also, I've seen this movie 3 times and only just now realized the light bulbs represent ideas because of the light bulb appearing above a character's head trope. How did I not realize that sooner? But the emotion story wouldn't work if we didn't care about the humans they're operating, and thankfully Riley isn't just a blank slate protagonist. She has depth, she has personality, you can easily see her struggles, and they're built up really well. You could clearly follow what she was going through, even if we weren't literally diving into her head. And the same goes for her parents too. I will say the comedy can be a little weak. There are some great gags. The gum commercial killed me when I first saw this movie, and it still makes me laugh hard. It just isn't some of the best I've seen come from these kinds of films.
The drama, on the other hand, is some of the strongest I've ever seen in any animated film.
I somehow did not cry at any of these movies, but this is one of the few that got me close. Joy in the Memory Dump hits harder than the opening of Up and the ending of Toy Story 3 combined. This is an all-around fantastic movie that totally deserves all of the hype it gets. People have been talking about it ever since it came out, and I guarantee they'll still be talking about it for years to come.
Why you booing me? I'm right.
Along with Toy Story 3, this is the part I expect people to get the most mad at, but unlike Toy Story 3, I am not apologetic in the slightest. Incredibles 2 is freaking amazing.
I really don't understand the hate this movie gets because I absolutely love it. It is almost everything I wanted from an Incredibles sequel. It further expands on the themes of the previous films, but this time from a different angle. The animation is absolutely gorgeous, the action scenes are even better than in the first movie, and we get so much more focus on the rest of the family. Bob learns that he needs to be there for his kids, but also finds himself struggling. Helen gets to shine as a hero, and we see her attempt to uncover this plot. Violet becomes even more unhappy about being a super due to it ruining her date. Jack actually matters to the plot outside of the very ending, and Dash can't do math. Okay, Dash could have used a little more, but the rest of the family really shines. Not to mention this movie really upped the comedy. It was great in the original, but this movie is hilarious. Jack finding the raccoon just kills me every time I see it, and seeing Edna show off his powers to Bob is just great. Have I mentioned she's one of the best characters in fiction? I really like that we get to see more heroes in here. They all have a great variety of powers, and them being mind-controlled leads to some really creative fight scenes.
But I guess I should bring up the 2 biggest issues that everyone talks about when complaining about this movie. The first is that Bob seems bitter that Helen is becoming a hero. Huh?
I mean, yeah, he's unhappy, but it's not because he's watching her succeed, it's because he feels like he's failing. He doesn't understand Dash's homework, royally screwed up Violet's dating life, and is trying to take care of a baby with more superpowers than he can even fathom. Helen was always the homemaker of the family, so seeing her do so well in his former position while he's struggling so much with hers isn't bitterness, it's imposter syndrome. He doesn't feel like he's good enough, and his arc is about him realizing that he doesn't have to be perfect. We saw this in the first movie, how he couldn't do everything himself, and this is a natural continuation of that. I mean, yeah, he seems upset in the beginning, but he was hoping he'd be able to resume hero work, which is what he's wanted for 15 years, so it's understandable he'd be disappointed.
And the second common complaint is the villain, which... yeah, is the movie's only big problem for me.
I will say I don't hate her as much as most people. For starters, Screenslaver is a fantastic name, and the idea of someone who can hypnotize people through technology is really cool. Plus, I love the idea that 2 characters experienced the exact same tragic event and came out with completely different ideologies. One thinks that Super should be reinstated because if they were available, they could have saved his parents. The other thinks they shouldn't because then people wouldn't rely on them even when they aren't there. That's a really interesting idea.
The problem is they just had to make it a friggin' twist!
It is painfully obvious it's one of them. The only mystery is which one, because with Evelyn it makes more sense, but because of that it might be trying to mislead you when it's really Winston. Either way, it's really easy to guess, and I knew it almost immediately. But even still, this is one of my top 10 favorite animated movies of all time. I'm willing to look past the flaws because the rest of the movie is just so freaking good. It's engaging, dramatic, funny, awesome, and an all-around great time. I don't get why people criticize this movie as much as they do, because I believe this is the best sequel Pixar has ever done. It totally lived up to the hype for me, and personally, I would love to see what they do for an Incredibles 3.
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
WALL-E is such a special film. Even at such a young age, I could tell there was something honestly magical about it. It's rare you see a movie where the most common criticism is that part of it's too good, but that's the case with WALL-E. The first half of this movie is told with almost no dialogue, which you think would be a turnoff, but it sucks you in so easily because the pacing and visual storytelling are just perfect. The intrigue of seeing WALL-E explore this desolate wasteland, making one of the most effective environmental stories ever told, the joy of watching him mess around with all these random objects, the mystery of Eve arriving and wondering what she's here for, watching the romance between the two of them blossom despite them not saying anything but their names, which WALL-E can't even get right, the sorrow of Eve shutting down due to the plant, all of it is just done so amazingly well. It certainly doesn't help that Eve is really slick and cool, and WALL-E is just an adorable little nugget. I love this little guy so much.
And contrary to most people, I love the second half of this film just as much as the first.
Seeing WALL-E explore the Axiom is really interesting. It's both funny, but also kinda disturbing seeing what all these people have become. Otto makes for such a strangely threatening villain, since not only is he in control of the entire ship, so there's nowhere to run, but the fact that he's simply following his programming makes it impossible to reason with him. He has his orders, and he's gonna follow them no matter what. The scene where WALL-E and Eve are flying through space is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and my favorite moment in the entire movie. And the captain is honestly a really good character. Despite him having such a small amount of screen time, we really see him grow to care more about the planet. And that line, "I don't want to survive, I want to live," just, so good. Plus, this is one of the few movies that does the fake-out death right, since you really feel the weight of not only WALL-E being crushed, but possibly not remembering who he is. It feels so sad, and it just makes his return feel so much better. The only possible issue I can think of is the other human characters maybe could have been a little more interesting. Aside from the captain, we only really see two of them, and honestly, I would have liked to see a bit more. That's a huge nitpick, though. This is easily among my top 5 favorite animated movies ever. I just love it so much. It's not every day you get something this artistic and beautiful made for families, but that just makes it even more special.
And you want to know what the craziest thing is? Even something amazing as WALL-E can't top this list, because in my opinion, Pixar already made a film that was even better. The only movie they've made that I would give a perfect 10 out of 10.
For almost as long as I can remember, Finding Nemo has been a film that I have just absolutely loved. Something about this movie just really connected with me in a way that I don't know if it has with other people. I know people really like this movie, but I don't often see it ranked as one of their favorites, but in a strange way, that just makes it more special to me. Almost every aspect of this movie is done perfectly. The opening sequence of this movie is one of the most devastating ways I've ever seen a family film start. We used to have to skip it because the Barracuda scared me. But it makes Marlin the most identifiable protagonist in all of Pixar. Nemo is the only family he has left, so naturally he's very overprotective of him. And Nemo wants to be able to explore on his own, but feels like he can't. Both of their perspectives are very understandable, and neither of them is necessarily right or wrong. And it leads to them blowing up at each other in a very natural way. But you still feel the connection they have, since when Nemo is taken, it's legit really intense, which makes the journey feel all the more important. Again, Nemo's not only Marlin's son, but the only remnant he has of his wife, so you can easily understand why he wants to get him back so bad. While Nemo is just a scared kid who was taken away from his home, it makes both of their attempts to see each other again that much stronger.
But that's only the beginning of what makes this movie so great.
Despite the opening of this movie being so intense, it has some of the best comedy in any animated movie I've ever seen. Marlin's dynamic with Dory is wonderful. I love the trope of an eternal optimist combined with an eternal pessimist, so combine that with Dory's short-term memory loss, which might seem like a weird gimmick at first, but it not only leads to some funny moments, it is a really important part of her character, and it's key to her growth throughout the film. And the Tank Gang also gets some great laughs. A lot of the other Pixar ensembles, there's always a few characters that don't really stand out, but I remember every single one of these guys, and I love all of them. I still quote this line from Peach to this day. For a CG movie released in 2003, the animation holds up amazingly well. The underwater scenes just look gorgeous, and some of the textures and little details are crazy impressive. But I think this movie's strongest element, aside from the characters, is the pacing. We get a fantastic balance of comedic, dark, lighthearted, and emotional moments over the course of the entire movie, and they fit together so well. We've got plenty of hilarious moments like the School of Fish, Dory speaking whale, and the initiation scene, which I can literally quote line for line. I've seen this movie so many times. Intense ones like the anglerfish chase and Nemo going in the filter, and even parts that have both, like the sharks and the jellyfish. And all of these scenes flow perfectly together, so the movie never drags.
This movie also has, without a doubt, my favorite scene in any Pixar film. And I never see anyone talk about it.
It's when Marlin and Dory are riding with the turtles, and he begins to explain why he's on this crazy adventure in the first place. We then see this message pass along to countless other creatures in the sea until it eventually reaches the very place that they're headed. Like I said earlier, I have never cried at a Pixar film, but this is the one that came the closest, and it's this line right here.
I mean, it sounds like this guy's gonna stop at nothing till he finds his son.
That one line right there is what this movie is all about.
You really feel the weight of this massive and crazy journey Marlin is going on, and you know for a fact he would do it all over again if it meant he could save his son, and it makes their reunion at the end feel all the more heartwarming. This, to me, is just a perfect movie. It's got great animation, wonderful characters, fantastic comedy, incredible emotional moments, and phenomenal pacing that just make it an absolute joy from beginning to end. This isn't just one of my favorite animated movies, it's one of my top 10 favorite movies, period. I've seen it more times than I can count, and I guarantee I'm gonna see it even more.
And there we go, that's all 28 Pixar movies. For all the ups and downs that the studio has had over the years, it was nice to finally see their entire filmography.
Because even the bad stuff they did have some things of value to them. I don't know what lies in store for the future of the studio, but I do know this. No matter how bad things might get at points, there will always be more films to remind us of what made this studio so popular in the first place. Thank you all for watching, and let me know if you want to see more videos like this from me. I know there's been a lot of ranking videos like this that have been done before, but since there's so many different opinions on some of these movies, every one of them is unique. But until next time, have a good night, and don't let the door hit you on the way out.